Hello, welcome to Train Signal. This is the introduction to Windows 7 lesson in the Windows 7 Administration Training course. In this lesson, we'll begin by reiterating some of the business objectives that have led GlobalMantic to begin considering Windows 7 as a desktop operating system. We'll then move into looking at some of the specific technologies that have gone into Windows 7 that make it such a compelling upgrade for GlobalMantic. Starting with user interface enhancements, then moving on to what's called branch cache, then direct access. Branch cache and direct access are technologies that will help remote offices and mobile workers in great ways. BitLocker and BitLocker to Go are next up on the agenda, and they're ways that GlobalMantic can increase the overall security of the desktop and mobile computing environment. Likewise, AppLocker will help GlobalMantic improve its overall security by disallowing applications that have not been approved by IT from being installed on desktops. This will help prevent malware from being installed in the environment, with things like keyloggers capturing passwords for the nefarious criminals of the underworld. We'll then move on to a compatibility item that's been added to Windows 7 called Windows XP Mode. Windows XP Mode provides a Windows XP operating system running under Windows 7 and allowing applications designed for Windows XP but not Windows 7, to still run under Windows 7. I'll then provide a little bit of information regarding group policy enhancements that have been made to Windows 7. And then we'll discuss improved power management in Windows 7 and why it will benefit GlobalMantic. For the last two items, we'll talk about the differences between 32-bit and 64-bit Windows 7, and then you'll see an overall Windows 7 editions comparison matrix that shows you all of these items side by side and shows you which editions of Windows 7 support which features. GlobalMantic is very interested in understanding what Windows 7 can bring to the table. Remember, Windows 7 is really the first version of Windows in a very long time that's capable of unseating Windows XP as the default corporate standard in many organizations, including GlobalMantic. Windows Vista was widely seen as a business failure in most organizations, so Windows 7 has been greeted with a lot of anticipation and excitement because it really can displace Windows XP and brings a lot to the table. GlobalMantic too sees major possibilities with Windows 7, and the CIO truly understands a lot of the appeal and why it can be such a benefit to move to Windows 7 rather than staying with Windows XP. He wants to understand Windows 7's new security features especially, and the mobility capabilities, as well as simply understanding what's changed since older versions of Windows. GlobalMantic has a number of business objectives that must be met with a rollout to Windows 7, and the Windows 7 new features must take into consideration these business objectives. GlobalMantic has to improve security in order to reassure customers and regulatory agencies that the company is taking their privacy seriously, and that there will be no more data breaches like the one that cost the company so much money recently. GlobalMantic also wants to improve employee productivity to increase sales and reduce overall operating expenses. Further, the company wants to contain rising communications infrastructure costs through the implementation of some possible new features in Windows 7, such as branch cache. Most importantly, the company does not want to have to add a ton of IT staff just to support Windows 7. They want to maintain current or close to current levels of staffing in the information technology department. We'll start our look at some of the new features of Windows 7 by looking at the user interface enhancements that Microsoft has made to the product. We're going to focus on four items: the taskbar, and then arrow, peek, snap, and shake. And we're going to get to take a look at a demonstration of all of those items in this lesson. The taskbar is the most noticeable improvement that Microsoft has made to Windows 7. As soon as you start the system, that's the first thing you see, that there's a different taskbar. It might operate slightly similarly to older versions of Windows, but it's got a whole new look and feel to it once you start using it. With the new taskbar, the clutter goes away. Basically, rather than having a whole bunch of windows open and a whole bunch of icons for each open window, the Windows 7 taskbar tries to tame the mess by grouping these icons or grouping these open windows in an accessible way from the taskbar. So for example, suppose you have multiple documents open on Microsoft Word. You'll have an icon for Microsoft Word right on the taskbar showing that Word is running, And then when you mouse over that icon, all of the open Word documents will appear before your eyes, and you can just choose which document you'd like to edit. You'll see that in just a minute. Now the taskbar also helps you to begin to lessen your reliance on the overall start menu. You can actually pin programs to the taskbar a la the Macintosh dock and run programs right from the taskbar. So, rather than having to go to the start menu, you could, for example, pin Microsoft PowerPoint or Microsoft Word right to the taskbar and run the program right from there. Now, 3 other interface improvements that Microsoft has made to Windows 7 are Arrow Peek, Arrow Snap, and Arrow Shake. Arrow Peek gives you a way to actually look at the desktop regardless of how many windows are open. It basically makes all of those windows transparent and allows you to take a look at the desktop. Arrow Snap makes it very, very easy for you to line documents up side by side. You might even say it makes it a snap. Yeah, you get it? Okay, I'll stop now. How often do you work with multiple documents that you want to have side by side so you can compare and contrast those documents? In the past, in order to make those documents comparable side by side, you would have to manually resize the windows so that one took half the window, one took the other half of the window. With Arrow Snap, the manual labor goes away, and you can focus on the task at hand instead, and you'll see that in just a minute. Arrow Shake is pretty cool. I like Arrow Shake. It's a way that you can shake a window and have all the other ones underneath it go away. So if you've got a cluttered up desktop and you have a window on top that you're trying to work with, but you're getting distracted by all the stuff behind it, just give the window a shake and all the other ones minimize. And we're going to go over and take a look at all this right now. As you can see, the first thing we're looking at here is the new taskbar. And I've got 4 icons on my taskbar. I've got Internet Explorer, Windows Explorer, and as you can see, when I mouse over this, what happens here is each of these windows pops up. So I get to see a list of the Explorer windows that I have open, and when I mouse over them, those ones show up on the screen so that I don't have to worry about trying to figure out which one I'm selecting. Then we have the same thing for PowerPoint, and again, when I mouse over it, you're going to see the PowerPoint presentation. And then there's Camtasia. Let's start by getting a look at what Arrow Peek is all about. I'm going to bring these windows back up, and you're going to see that they take up some space on the screen. Now imagine you have 30 of these windows up. Your screen is filled up, and you need to know what you got on your desktop. There's an icon there that you want to see if it's there, whatever the case may be. If you take a look over at the right-hand side of the taskbar on Windows 7, you're going to see this rectangular thing. Well, just hold your mouse over that. Just holding the mouse over it without clicking makes all of the windows on the screen transparent, just showing their outlines so that you can see exactly what's on the desktop. That's pretty cool. If you give it a click, even the outlines go away so that it's even more clear what's on the desktop. And if you click again, your windows come back to their original positions, so you don't have to worry about messing around with moving the windows back into place. Pretty sweet. Nice feature. What's even cooler is Arrow Snap. Let's pretend these are 2 Word documents, okay? And you want to line them up side by side. Or even better, let's pretend they're exactly what they are. They're libraries. They happen to be the same libraries, but if they were different libraries, you could compare and contrast what's in those libraries in a very easy way. To enable Arrow Snap, just take any of the windows by their header bar and drag to one side of the screen. You'll notice that you see an outline now of a half a window. When you let go of the mouse, see what happens. That window now takes up half the screen. Likewise, if I move over to the other side, this window now takes up half the screen. All I've got to do is drag the title bar and drag it to the side of the screen, and that's what happens. Now, better yet, when you're done working with this comparison, just drag away from the top of the screen, and the windows go back to their original size without you having to resize them. Arrow Peek is also good for moving to full screen mode. All you've got to do is drag a window by its title bar to the top of the screen, and that window then goes full screen. Again, when you drag away, the window goes back to its original size. The last arrow feature that we'll talk about is shake. Now, let's suppose we've got all this stuff open. I'm going to go back to this window. And you've got all of this stuff. You want to work in this window for some reason. You've got all of this stuff around here that's sort of distracting. And rather than having to go through and minimize all the other windows, all you've got to do is grab this window by its title bar and give it a shake. Immediately, all the other windows minimize. And you are left with a nice, clean-looking train signal desktop that you can work with without having to get distracted by everything around you. So it's all grouped very nicely through the icons that are running on the taskbar, and you have all of these features to be able to manage the programs that are running under these icons, the windows that are enabling these programs. So they're pretty nice additions to Windows 7. Now, a couple of other features of the Windows 7 taskbar are the ability to add and remove programs that are pinned to the taskbar. For example, suppose you don't like Internet Explorer or you don't want it on your taskbar. You can right-click that IE icon and choose Unpin this program from the taskbar, and then it goes away. Likewise, if you have a program you use a lot, you can pin it to the taskbar, such as Microsoft PowerPoint or Camtasia or Windows Explorer. But let's go choose another program. Let's put IE back. Let's say you're going to use IE a lot, so you want it on the taskbar. Go up and find IE, right-click it, and choose Pin to Taskbar. You can also order these icons in any way you like. If you want IE to be first like it was, just hold it and drag it back over to its original position. So the taskbar has become a very, very configurable item. It's a very usable item. Before we move on with the rest of this lesson, I'd like to draw your attention to the graphic you see at the left-hand side of your screen. You're going to see this graphic appear throughout this course, and what this is telling you is in what editions of Windows a particular feature exists. The yellow button in this particular slide means that this feature has partial functionality in that particular edition of Windows. So, user interface enhancements are partially enabled in the Starter Edition and Home Basic editions of Windows 7, while all of the features are fully functional in Home Premium, Professional, Enterprise, and Ultimate. If there's a red X instead of a yellow splotch or a green splotch sitting there, that means that feature is completely non-existent in that particular edition of Windows. We'll be using this exact same graphic throughout the course to help you learn and identify which editions of Windows have which features. Now let's move on to a feature truly new in Windows 7 called Branch Cache. Branch Cache is a feature that's new to Windows 7 that also requires the use of Windows Server 2008 R2 somewhere along the line. Branch Cache is a technology that can increase network responsiveness when you're trying to access applications or files that sit back at headquarters from one of Global Mantic's remote offices. It basically gives the users at one of those remote offices a similar experience as if they were working right at the headquarters branch. Now, the really nice part about that is this increases their productivity while reducing bandwidth costs over time because of the way that material is cached. Basically, when Branch Cache is enabled, a copy of the data that you access back at headquarters is cached to a local machine at their local site. That machine can be either a Windows 7 machine or a Windows Server 2008 R2 machine. This will allow the Global Mantic's remote offices to cache headquarters-based content to one of those machines that's hosted at a remote branch. This will also reduce bandwidth costs, and because of the way this whole thing works and it increases productivity, it will help make sure that Global Mantic remains more competitive in the marketplace. So let's take a quick peek at how this whole thing works. This blue document is the original copy of a document. Let's say it's a sales document that's used by the salespeople who work in each of the regional offices. And it's been updated, so everyone's going to be going to get a copy of it the day after it's updated. Well, the people in the Southwest office have their own file server. So there's a workstation out here that accesses this document through the internet to the headquarters network. The first time that document's accessed, it's going to be brought down to the GM SW file server, which will also be a branch cache server. and then subsequent accesses to this document at headquarters will be rerouted to this server instead, so the request will stay local rather than going out over an expensive wide area network connection. This has two effects. One, it keeps traffic off this connection so that it stays alive for other things and reduces costs that way. And two, this connection is going to be slower than the connections inside the Southwest office, so the person's going to get their document more quickly, increasing their productivity. This is called branch cache hosted mode, and this is because it's using a Windows Server 2008 R2 file server to handle the caching. The Northeast office does not have a file server. They've just got a bunch of workstations. In this case, branch cache can operate in what's called distributed cache mode. In this case, a Windows 7 desktop computer will act as the branch cache machine, and it will operate in the same way. The first time the file is accessed from headquarters, it'll be cached down to this branch cache machine. Say that 5 times real fast. Subsequent accesses will then go to that cache machine rather than all the way up to headquarters to get the document. So from that perspective, again, it's going to be a cost saver, and it's also going to be a productivity enhancer, so it's a good thing all across the board. I'm going to go on the record here as saying that I hate VPNs, virtual private networks. I don't hate VPNs themselves, but I hate the complexity they can bring to both the networking side of the equation and the complexity they can introduce to the user who has to go through the pain of establishing a VPN connection every time he wants to access the network. Direct Access aims to ease some of this pain by making it much more seamless for the end user to access resources and much easier for IT to manage remote computers. This is a new feature to Windows 7 and Windows Server 2008 R2, and it can actually replace a traditional VPN connection. Direct Access, as I mentioned, requires 2008 R2 server as a host, and for the purposes of Global Mantic, they have a server right now called GM-Remote that they will ultimately use as a Direct Access connectivity machine. Direct Access is a way that you can establish what's called bidirectional connectivity with a user's laptop or mobile computer. Now the beauty of this is it's completely seamless to the user. And the Direct Access takes effect as soon as the computer boots, not after login. One of the challenges of many VPN connections is the fact that until a user logs in, they don't have access to the corporate network. Now, once they've logged in, then they can initiate a VPN connection and go on their merry way. The challenge here is the fact that they have to log in first means that their computer is not going to be as easily checked for health conditions and things like that, and that means that there's a little bit less security inherent in one of these connections that there wouldn't be in Direct Access. Now, Direct Access allows IT, as soon as the computer is turned on, not logged in, but as soon as the computer is turned on, to push updates down to that machine as well. With a VPN connection, IT could push updates down to the machine if they really wanted to, but the user would first have to establish a VPN connection. With Direct Access in play, that computer acts just like it's sitting on the corporate network behind the firewall, so IT can completely manage that host. So there's a huge benefit there. Now, overall, this improves security. So basically, IT is going to be able to make sure that that machine has updates. That machine will be subject to health checks, and the user is going to get seamless, secure access to behind the firewall information that would otherwise be inaccessible or hard to access. This is a security win for Global Mantic, and this is a feature that they're really going to want to use as they recover from their recent security breach and start to implement more security measures to keep their information safe and secure and regain the trust of their customers. The expected business outcomes here are what we mentioned. Mobile workers will enjoy seamless access to the headquarters IT services. IT can remotely install software updates to mobile computers very quickly. Moreover, they can enforce group policies more easily. This will improve overall regulatory compliance measures that are already taking place and being improved all the time at Global Mantic. By the time you're finished deploying Windows 7 throughout Global Mantic, you're going to be a lover of BitLocker and BitLocker to Go, new and enhanced features in Windows 7. BitLocker first showed up in Windows Vista. BitLocker to Go is making its first appearance here in Windows 7. BitLocker is basically a full disk encryption service. It allows you to fully encrypt a disk as many volumes as you like. Remember before the Global Mantics high-level finance person lost his laptop and it had a lot of sensitive customer data? If that disk had been subject to BitLocker, this would not have been an issue for Global Mantics. That full disk would have been encrypted and unhackable to a point. Of course, no encryption is perfect, but it would have provided a huge level of safety for Global Mantics and saved them a lot of embarrassment and a lot of money. BitLocker in Windows 7 is enhanced with BitLocker to Go, which will also encrypt USB-based removable storage devices. Remember, encryption is not just a lost laptop issue. More people have USB flash drives now than you can shake a stick at. You can go to Walmart and buy one for $10, and people use them for everything. And they get lost all the time. The worst part is when somebody loses a flash drive, they don't generally call IT and say, hey, I lost my $9 flash drive. Can you get me a new one or whatever? And you don't even know what's on that flash drive. So it's important that steps be taken to make sure that the information that's on those flash drives is protected. And that's where BitLocker to Go comes in. Now, basically, in a nutshell, BitLocker will help prevent unauthorized people from breaking into Windows if a machine is stolen or lost or whatever happens to that machine. In Windows 7, BitLocker has been enhanced to be easier to use. Now, rather than having to go through what was a somewhat painful implementation process, you can right-click a drive and choose to enable BitLocker. Windows 7 BitLocker also adds what's called a data recovery agent that adds support for this data recovery agent for all protected volumes. This allows the Information Technology Department to say that all BitLocker protected volumes are encrypted with an appropriate data recovery agent. And this data recovery agent is then written to a data volume to allow authorized IT staff access to a BitLocker protected volume. After all, people do sometimes leave an organization and they're not always happy on the way out the door. And you want to make sure that you can still access their resources even after they've left. So this way, BitLocker's, the stuff that's on that laptop is still accessible even if an employee is not willing to provide access to it. Now, if you don't want to get into the full-fledged BitLocker game, you can actually just implement BitLocker to Go to protect USB storage devices. Now, Global Mantics is going to implement BitLocker, the full disk encryption, so we're not going to have to worry about that for Global Mantics. But if you're working on this in your own organization, understand that BitLocker to Go can be used by itself. The business outcomes that are going to come from BitLocker are majorly improved mobile system security. This is going to lead to greater customer confidence and many fewer regulatory issues. Centralized encryption keys mean fewer headaches for IT staff. You don't want to worry about having a crack in encryption, which you really can't half the time, and then lose data. You don't want the protection scheme to become a hindrance to other things. BitLocker helps to alleviate that issue. Another brand new feature in Windows 7 is called AppLocker. AppLocker is the next evolution from software restriction policies. AppLocker provides granular application control to help prevent the execution of unauthorized software in the environment. Now, the intent for AppLocker is to be able to say, I don't want this piece of software running because it creates an insecure environment, or we are going to end up with unlicensed software in the organization. Unlicensed software can be a major hassle for an organization as well, and Global Mantics wants to make sure they don't introduce software to the organization that's either going to damage the organization or it's going to create a licensing issue for the organization. You can stop users from running applications that consume network bandwidth, that are unlicensed, or in any way, shape, or form just affect the overall computing environment. You can provide users with a list of software that's allowed to run through AppLocker. Basically, here's the list of approved software, and those applications, and only those applications, will run. This helps to ensure that the desktop environment stays compliant with policies and regulatory requirements. This improves the overall security of the Global Mantics desktop environment. And you maintain higher levels of productivity by denying the use of unauthorized software and reducing the possibility of malware infestations that could lead to further security breaches down the road. Microsoft has become a big player in the virtualization marketplace, and they've brought this virtualization experience to bear on Windows 7 to help make the issue of software compatibility a thing of the past. Windows XP Mode is a new feature of Windows 7 that leverages Microsoft's virtual PC virtualization technology to ensure software compatibility in Windows 7. The way Windows XP Mode works is it runs software inside a virtualized copy of Windows XP with Service Pack 3. This software is then delivered to the Windows 7 desktop via RDP. Now, even better, the software that you run this way can actually be put onto the Windows 7 Start menu, and the Windows XP Mode running operating system stays completely behind the scenes. So to the user, the whole idea that this product is running in Windows 7 is completely seamless. They see it as just another application icon on their Start menu. From a business perspective, the GlobalMantic's financial application will run under Windows 7 using this Windows XP Mode. Better yet, the users won't even know what's happening. This will streamline the migration to Windows 7 and will allow GlobalMantic to move to the same operating system across the board and not have to worry about the compatibility issues that would have in the past been a major hindrance to such a rollout. From an operational perspective, this is how Windows XP Mode works. This is the GlobalMantic Windows 7 desktop. This is a virtual machine running under that desktop, running Windows XP Service Pack 3. This application is delivered seamlessly to this desktop, and this shows up on this Windows 7 machine right on its Start menu, so that the user doesn't even know that they're running this virtualized application. Makes life a lot easier for the user and makes it much easier on IT to support, so that they don't have to worry about supporting different operating systems on a whole bunch of different computers. Group policy has been around a long, long time. Windows 7 brings group policy to a new level by adding dozens of new group policies to provide more centralized management of the overall computing environment. As you may know, group policy is a way that you can provide centralized control over the entire environment, and pretty much every aspect of Windows is included in group policy. In Windows 7, you can control how BitLocker works. You can control new power management features that are included in Windows 7. You can actually restrict the use of certain devices such as USB flash drives and CD writers. You can control branch cache settings and IPv6 configuration items, as well as a number of other items, right from one centralized location. Better yet, once a group policy is created, you can push it out with the click of a button to every desktop in your organization. Between group policy and direct access, your group policy items are immediately pushed down to direct access enabled desktops as well, or laptops. So machines that are connected to your environment over direct access will immediately receive new group policies as well. You don't have to wait for them to reconnect through the VPN. So it makes for a much more secure environment. From a business perspective, GlobalMantic is going to enjoy improved security through this centralized enforcement of group policies, especially as it pertains to mobile computers using direct access. Desktop management total cost of ownership is always reduced whenever you can centralize resource management. Group policies show this in spades and more. Group policies are incredibly powerful tools. We'll be using group policies on and off throughout this entire course. Windows 7 also brings much improved power management to every single edition of the product, from the starter up to Ultimate. Windows 7 is much more granular in managing power and makes every attempt to eke every ounce of power out of every device that it possibly can in order to increase battery life and reduce electric bills. Even audio chips in Windows 7 are power managed. If nothing is using the audio processor, Windows 7 will bring it into a low power mode so that it doesn't use as much electricity. Windows 7 also supports ambient light sensors, so that if you're in a bright room or a dark room, the display on a laptop, for instance, will adjust lighter or darker depending on the exterior lighting. Now, in addition to all this stuff, Windows 7 brings a few other power management tricks to the table. When it comes to the display actually uses about 40% of a laptop's power. A display still turns off after 10 or 15 minutes, just like it always have. But now you can have a display go into a dimmed mode when it hasn't been used for, say, 2 minutes. When it's in this dimmed mode, it uses less power. Now, if you haven't been using the laptop for 2 or 3 minutes, it's not going to turn the display off completely, but it will dim it as a way to conserve power. Another way that Windows 7 improves power management is through the reduction in power to networking items that are not being used. Many people use wireless networks now, especially if they're on the road using laptops. As such, the wired network port is not being used. So, Windows places that into a low power state and keeps that power available for what the user really needs. And that's a way to extend battery life. The less energy that is used by the Global Mantic desktop and laptop and computing environment is the lower the power bill that Global Mantic has to pay each month. Now, the longer the battery life for mobile workers means the more time that mobile sales force can spend with customer FaceTime, which leads to increased productivity and increased sales. So anything that the Global Mantic infrastructure can do to help those people stay on task and generating revenue is a good thing for the company. Windows 7 also continues Microsoft's foray into 64-bit computing that was really started once Windows Vista came out. Windows XP does have a 64-bit edition, but it wasn't really all that useful. Windows Vista really brought 64-bit computing into the mainstream, and Windows 7 is continuing that trend. These editions of Windows are increasing in popularity, especially as the needs for large amounts of memory continues to rise. 32-bit machines, which is the traditional computer, has a 4 gigabyte memory limit, so you can't address more than 4 gigs of memory in these machines. In fact, in most cases, it's even less because of the way that the machines have to allocate RAM. You're usually only able to use about 3.25 gigs of this RAM. In the starter edition of Windows, only 2 gigs is accessible. Notice that the starter edition does not support 64-bit computing, and it only supports 2 gigs of RAM. This is the edition of Windows 7 intended for netbooks and doesn't really have much use in this course. We will not be discussing the starter edition in this course very much. 64-bit versions of Windows, however, bring a lot more RAM to bear. The Professional, Enterprise, and Ultimate editions of Windows 7 bring 192 gigs of limits on RAM. It's a ton of RAM. I don't even know what you use it for on a laptop or desktop, to be perfectly honest. Even the Home editions of Windows 7, Home Premium allows 16 gigs and Home Basic allows up to 8 gigs of RAM, bring a lot of RAM to bear. So for those that need a lot of RAM, Windows 7 64-bit is where it's at. And there's different limits depending on the different editions of Windows, but suffice it to say that Windows 7 is going to continue to help push organizations onto the 64-bit bus. Global Mantic does have some need for 64-bit Windows for large amounts of RAM. Now, in order to use 64-bit Windows, the processor has to support a 64-bit operating system. Just about every new computer that's sold these days is going to have a processor that will support this need. The software that's being run has to be compatible with a 64-bit operating system, or you have to use Windows XP mode. So you can't run a 64-bit application on 32-bit Windows. In a lot of cases, you can run 32-bit programs on 64-bit, but not always. So you have to make sure your software is actually compatible with a 64-bit operating system. If you're going to make the move from a 32-bit to a 64-bit operating system, one area that's not negotiable lies in hardware devices. The drivers for those devices must have available 64-bit drivers. You cannot use the 32-bit drivers in this case. If you're upgrading Windows from Windows Vista to Windows 7, or trying to upgrade from Windows 7 32-bit to Windows 7 64-bit, you cannot do an in-place upgrade. You must reinstall Windows from scratch in order to move from 32-bit to 64-bit Windows. Windows 7 comes in a number of editions. What you see on your screen is a list of all of the features we talked about in this lesson, along with which editions are applicable to the feature. As you can see, only the Enterprise and Ultimate editions of Windows 7 have the capability to use all of the features we discussed. The Professional Edition does have quite a few of the features, but it's missing branch cache, direct access, BitLocker, and AppLocker capability. We're going to be focusing on the Enterprise Edition of Windows 7 in this course. I did, however, want to tell you and make sure you are aware that the different editions of Windows have very different capabilities. All along the way, you saw the little icon chart down the left-hand side of the screen to show you which editions of Windows supported the particular feature. You're going to see that little icon chart throughout this entire course just to help you make sure you understand which editions of Windows support a feature. And so that if you're trying to apply this to a different edition of Windows in your own environment, that you know whether or not a particular feature is going to work. Now, the reason that these little icons here are yellow under user interface enhancements is because the Windows 7 Starter Edition doesn't support the arrow interface at all, and the Home Basic Edition is limited in what it supports. Windows 7 does feature, the Starter Edition does have the new taskbar, so that's why this has a yellow circle instead of a red X. We covered a number of items in this lesson. We started by discussing the business objectives behind a potential move to Windows 7 for Global Mantic. We then talked about how Global Mantic could benefit from the new user interface enhancements that come with most editions of Windows 7. We then talked about two remote tools called Branch Cache and Direct Access, which help make the computing experience more seamless for users that are operating outside headquarters. We then learned about two security features that Windows 7 brings to the table, BitLocker and AppLocker. BitLocker is full drive encryption that will help Global Mantic take steps towards recovering from their recent security incident, and AppLocker will help them stay secure by disallowing the use of particular applications in the organization. A migration to Windows 7 is not a no-brainer when it comes to software compatibility, however. This is where Windows XP Mode comes in. Windows XP Mode takes the sting out of software compatibility by providing users with a virtual Windows XP environment in which to run applications seamlessly in Windows 7. The user doesn't even know it's happening because those applications actually show up on the Windows 7 Start menu just like they would if the application was installed natively. We briefly touched on some group policy enhancements that come with Windows 7, and you learned about how Windows 7 sips power, particularly in a mobile environment, and how it can lower utility bills and extend battery life. You then delved under the hood and talked a little bit about 32-bit versus 64-bit Windows 7 and what the primary differences are between these two architectures. We finished up with a summary of the Windows 7 editions in a visual comparison matrix that you can look at to determine which editions of Windows support particular features. And that is the end of this lesson. Thank you very much.